Welcome to my bar mitzvah. Easy yofi.
Nice to see everybody and everybody's names. And per Zoom protocol, we will wait just a minute before we will get started.
Very good. Lenny's here. Hi, Lenny. Very good. I think I actually recognize some of the names. This is cool.
That's good.
Yeah.
All right, it's 11:31, so we're going to get started. So again, good morning on behalf of the Jewish Federation. I want to welcome you to, sadly, our final session of Exploring the Land, Crossroads of Our Faith. I am Karen Rader, and today Jody Girth is working with me as well. As usual, the session today will be recorded or is being recorded right now, and we will forward it on to you later this week if you would like to watch it again. We're asking everyone to remain mute during the presentation. Gotti may take a break midway through for questions or possibly at the end. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to them when there is a break. So today's tour will take us to the ancient city of JAFFA or Yaffo, the century-old neighborhood of Neve Tzedek, and the modern city of Tel Aviv. Please make yourselves comfortable as Gotti continues to weave the history together for us. Gotti, the floor is yours.
Okay, toda rabba. Shalom, everyone, from Modi'in, Israel, where we're getting ready for elections and again, and the COVID numbers are doing well. Actually, everyone's getting vaccinated and things are looking on the up and up. And we are going to talk about a little bit about the ancient and the beginning, and then about the modern part of the state of Israel, and see the connection, I hope, between Christianity and Judaism and how in Jaffa and in Tel Aviv those things connect together. So let us share the screen and let's see what we got here. This is a program actually that fills the screen, which is great. So thank you again to our friends at Google that are allowing us to use these amazing technologies. And if you've been to Israel, you probably recognize where we are. We're on the top of the TEL of Jaffa and overlooking the high rises of Tel Aviv. This is the Mediterranean. We'll talk a little bit about St. Peter's Church, which is this big church over here. And the main thing that we're going to see here today on this TEL, I think we've talked a little bit about a TEL and what it is, but it's basically an artificial hill built by the layers of history. There's a hill, and then a group comes and builds on top, destroys the previous and builds on top, and eventually you have an artificial hill. So down below, down here actually, are even some Egyptian remains from Pharaoh Tutmos III. Don't worry about the name, it won't be on the test, but we know that it's him because he conquers the area and leaves a list in the El Amarna letters, fairly famous collection of tablets that were found with the description of the conquest of Pharaoh Tutmos III. So we're talking 3,500 years ago, about 500 years before King David and the Exodus from Egypt and so on. And what we're seeing here actually is a gate designed, it's a modern sculpture, designed to look like an Egyptian gate. And here you have three major scenes of the Jewish history. And on the right here, it's a little hard to make it out, but you'll take my word for it. There's an older man and a younger man and a ram that's caught in the bushes. And of course, I'm talking about this scene, which is the binding of Isaac. And what does the binding of Isaac have to do with all of this? Well, the binding of Isaac is the bris, or the brit in modern Hebrew, that talks about the connection of Abraham and God's, Abraham representing the Jewish people, of course, God representing him or herself, and the Brit, the covenant between Abraham and God, or the Jewish people and God. The second scene over here is lots of angels going up and down a ladder, and of course, we're talking about um, Jacob and his dream wrestling with an angel. And if you remember the story, Jacob is running away from his brother Esau that he thinks is going to kill him. He falls asleep in a place that he later on calls Bet El, the house of God. We think somewhere near Ramallah of today, north of Jerusalem. And in his dream, he sees angels going up and down, and then someone starts to wrestle with him. Little did this guy know that Jacob was the captain of the Greco-Roman wrestling team in high school. Just kidding, there's no Greco-Roman yet, but Jacob subdues the other guy, and the other guy says, okay, I give up. And it turns out that the other guy was an angel, and he says to Jacob, you have just wrestled with God and prevailed. And from this point on, you are no longer going to be called Yaakov or Jacob. Your name will now be Yisrael, or Israel, which means in Hebrew, Yisrael wrestles with God and prevails. So again, you're probably wondering, okay, but we're in JAFFA. What does this have to do with anything? Wait for it. We're getting to that point, because the third scene that you see over here is a bunch of Israelites carrying what looks like the Ark of the Covenant, holding some shofarot, a shofar, in their hands. And this is the scene of the conquest of Jericho. Why Jericho? Because when the people of Israel are wandering through the desert coming from Egypt in the story of the Exodus, which we're going to be telling very, very soon, sooner than you think, actually, coming up soon. The story, of course, of the wandering of the Israelites in the desert. They eventually come into the land, and the first city that they encounter is the city of Jericho. So essentially, that was the entryway by Jericho to the land by the Israelites. And all of this is to tell us that JAFFA in the modern time, as well as in the ancient times, is the entryway of our people into the land. It was the port of JAFFA was the entryway in ancient times, as well as in the 19th and 20th century of the people entering into the land. It was the Ben Gurion airport, if you will, of the ancient times. And this gate represents that connection. Why the story of Yisrael, or Israel? Because of the newly found state of Israel that was named after that struggle. And of course, to remind us with the bris, or the covenant, that this is the land that God promised to his people. So that was a long opening, but what we're going to continue here is we're going to go down from this area, from this, here you can see a little bit better what this sculpture looks like, or this gate, slightly better understanding of what we're seeing here. But we're going to continue, and we walk down from the top of the hill. This, by the way, is the Batman lair. I didn't know if you know that, but Batman resides in JAFFA. Just kidding. This is an abandoned building, and there are bats in there. So whenever there's kids around, I usually take them to see the bats. But I came here to show you the beautiful view of the Mediterranean and the beautiful view of Tel Aviv. And when you stand up here, we're reminded of a few other stories about JAFFA. JAFFA is a port city from way back when, probably 5,000 years ago, a group of Canaanites known as the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, or Phoenicia, is believed to be Lebanon of today, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and those port cities. The Phoenicians were seagoers. They went all around the Mediterranean. And in fact, every now and then they'd have to pull in to a port to get some water and supplies. So they created port cities all around the Mediterranean, and Jaffa was one of those cities. The Phoenicians like to have parties on the beach, and they would have bonfires, and they realized that when you heat up the sand, what do you get? Glass. And of course, Phoenician glass is very famous around the world. Even today, they made little vessels, little tiny containers used for perfumes and other crazy stuff. But the bottom line is the first ones probably to use Jaffa as a port were probably the Phoenicians 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. We know that Jaffa is also famous in one of our biblical stories, and this is of course a big hint about which story I'm talking about, because on Yom Kippur we read this story in our Haftorah, and that is the story of Jonah and the whale. So Jonah, it tells us in the story, was supposed to go to Nineveh, which is northern Iraq, eastern Syria of today, which when you think of it, why would he get on a boat if he's going from the land of Israel to northern Iraq? It's not exactly any ocean to cross there. But Jonah, instead of going to where he was supposed to go, he's trying to run away from his assignment. And he gets on a boat, and of course we know the rest of the story. There's a big storm. God doesn't allow him to run away from his destiny. He jumps overboard or thrown overboard, and the storm calms, but he's swallowed up by a big fish. It doesn't say whale, by the way, it says big fish, but the fish spits him out after 3 days. The 3 days is important. I'll mention it again very soon in the story. Jonah comes ashore, he survives, but while he's inside the whale, we know that we read this on Yom Kippur because he goes through some stages of, God, I promise you, I'll be a good boy. Just give me another chance. I understand that I didn't do what you told me to do, but please give me another chance. And of course, when he survives, he then goes on his mission and goes to Nineveh to talk to the powers that be about the people living in the land of Israel. So Jonah and the whale from Jaffa, that's an important story. And that whale that you just saw is actually a statue on the street in Jaffa. Another important thing to understand here is that all of this major metropolitan area that you see here, all of these high rises are actually only from the last 120 or 130 years. Jaffa is the old city of Tel Aviv, and everything we see out here was only created in the late 19th, early 20th century. You can see some small red roof houses in the forefront over there. Here's a close-up of some of those buildings, mostly 2-story buildings, 3-story buildings. That is the neighborhood of Neve Tzedek, which we'll visit soon. And that's the first neighborhood outside of the walls of Jaffa. Yes, Jaffa used to have walls. In fact, we're standing here on this ramp that goes down the street that many of you might remember walking down towards the clock tower. It's part of the Crusader era walls of the city. But the Ottomans, about 100 years ago, decided that Jaffa didn't need walls anymore. Luckily, in Jerusalem, they left them because I think it's a interesting, pretty feature of the city, but here in Jaffa, they did not remain. Okay, so let's explore some of the old Jaffa highlights. So this is an important church because Jaffa is extremely important in the Christian story. Some Jewish tours usually come to Jaffa maybe to do some shopping in the beautiful alleyways and the artist shops. But in terms of the story, Jaffa is very important. Why? Because it's a city or a place that's mentioned in the Christian Bible. Jesus, as far as we know, did not come here. It's not mentioned anywhere in the Christian Bible that Jesus was here. However, after Jesus is crucified, his disciples continue to spread the word of Jesus as the Messiah. If you remember, he is resurrected on Passover or Easter, and this actually happens on a Sunday, right? He's crucified on Friday. It's called Good Friday. And then he's placed in the tomb and on Friday afternoon. And on Sunday, which is Easter Sunday, he's in fact resurrected and is sort of in limbo for 50 days. And on that 50th day, the disciples and all of his followers gather back in Jerusalem. What happens 49 plus a day after Passover? Hint, we count the Omer. It's the holiday of Shavuot. It's the next pilgrimage holiday. All of the people of Israel gather again in Jerusalem. And on that day, which is known as the Pentecost, Jesus finally leaves this world after making appearances in all kinds of places and goes up to join his Father in heaven. But during these 50 days, he appears in all kinds of different places. That's when he walks on water, and that's where he appears to the disciples by the Sea of Galilee, and so on. After all of this, Peter goes to Rome to try and convince the powers that be to allow early Christians to follow the story of Jesus and to worship as they want. As you know, the did not end very well, because what is the main focal point of the area of the Vatican, the center of the Catholic world in Italy? Anybody remember? Anybody been there? What is the main big basilica over there? It's called St. Peter's Basilica, and the remains of St. Peter are at the bottom of that, in the crypt of that basilica. If you've watched Angels and Demons, obviously, of Dan Brown, you probably know that as well. But Peter is crucified by the Romans, in fact, crucified upside down, which is more derogatory, more demeaning than being crucified in the usual way. But before he goes on his voyage, he lives in Jaffa for a little bit. It's called Joppa or Joppa in the New Testament, in the Christian Bible, which is why this church is called St. Peter's Church. Okay, Peter, if we look at the church inside, we'll actually see that here, or actually not inside, on the top here, it's a little hard to see, but you can see that there's a cross, and under the cross, there's a rock. That rock is brought from this place, from the Banyas, or a place called Caesarea Philippi, because in this place, Caesarea Philippi, all the way in the north of Israel, this was a center that Jesus and the disciples went to in order to try and convince all of the people around to join them. And it was a city of pagans, a symbol of paganism. They were worshiping the god Pan and some other Roman gods. And in this place, Jesus says to Peter, "You are the rock on top of which I will build my church." And that basically means that Peter, for the Catholic world, is the first pope. He's the first messenger, or the first continuation of God on earth. And for the more Protestant evangelical world, it's a more of a symbolic idea that Peter is the one who moves forward with this idea of moving Christianity and the belief in Jesus. So St. Peter's Church, very important in the story. While Jesus is sitting around here, he stays in the house of a man named Simon, and Simon is a tanner. We'll talk about that in a moment, but take a look at this beautiful courtyard, or the beautiful square of Jaffa. This always reminds me like we're in the Caribbean or something. This is a modern church built in the 1920s, but basically representing the story of Peter and his voyage to go to Rome. And Jaffa, a lot of what we're going to see in terms of Old City Jaffa is actually not that old. It's about 300 years old from the time of the Ottomans, no more than that. So a lot of these buildings are actually Ottoman, 300 years old. And underneath, of course, there's remains that go all the way as far as 5,000 years ago. And one of the interesting things that we run into over here is this guy. Anybody, any guesses about who this guy looks like? So it is who you think it is. It's actually Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte was in Jaffa, believe it or not, 1799. He conquers the old city, or conquers the Holy Land. He wants to be the next Charlemagne. He comes from Egypt along the coast. And luckily, he brought with him some scientists that were part of this new science called archaeology. And they found an interesting stone in Egypt known as the Rosetta Stone. It's not the translation company that, or learning languages that you know about. But in a moment, you'll understand why they're called that, because the Rosetta Stone is a important stone. It's about it's about 6 feet high, and it has on it 3 different paragraphs in different languages that mean the same thing. In Greek, in Akkadian, and in the Egyptian hieroglyphics. And the reason it's so important is because that was the first time that archaeologists and scientists were able to decipher what the hieroglyphics mean. So it was good in some ways that Napoleon came to this region. He tried to get to Jerusalem. He was unsuccessful, but the municipality of Jaffa, Tel Aviv, seems to think it's a good idea to have Napoleons around directing traffic. Anyway, we continue down to a very important place for the Christian world, and that is, as you can see here, the house of Simon the Tanner. So who is Simon the Tanner, and how does he fit into the story? So when Peter is staying in Jaffa, he actually goes to a place called Lada, or Lod of today, closer to the airport, a little bit farther east, where he cures a woman by the name of Tabitha. And Tabitha is a young lady who fell asleep, probably lost consciousness. I'm blanking on that word, of course, but he is able to revive her. He says to her, Tabitha, wake up, 3 times, and she is revived. And another story that happens here while he is in Jaffa is that he is hosted by this guy, Simon. And Simon is a tanner. What does a tanner do? So let's take a look. A tanner is a guy who works on leather. It's a very, very important role in the Jewish tradition, because a tanner doesn't only make the Armani and Gucci wallets and sandals and all of that cool stuff. What does a tanner do that's important for the Jewish tradition? This. He makes the scrolls that the Torah and the ancient important books are written on. So a tanner is an important role, but it's also a role or a profession that was very stinky. They used all kinds of different elements in order to soften the leather. So the tanners a lot of time lived outside of the city, or at least in a place where they were not going to make everything very smelly. And while Peter is staying here, he has a big lunch, and he goes up on the roof to enjoy the breeze that's coming in. And after you've had a big lunch and it's nice and cool on a hot day, what do people usually want to do? They want to take a nap. So he falls asleep and he has a dream. And in that dream, here's a drawing of that dream. He sees all of the animals of the world coming down from the heavens, but they are wrapped in shrouds. Now in Judaism, when something's wrapped in shrouds, what does that mean? That means that it's dead, right? That's how we bury our dead not in a coffin, but rather wrapped in shrouds. And all of these animals are actually dead. And Jesus says to him in his dream, take these animals and eat. In other words, you can eat all of these animals, all of this different animals that exist in the world. And Peter says to him, but some of them are not kosher. And there's an argument back and forth in the scriptures about whether or not all of the animals that are put here on this earth by God are allowed to be eaten by people. And of course, the laws of kashrut and all of that are involved in all of this. But the bottom line is that Peter wakes up from the dream and he understands that all of the animals of the world should be allowed to be eaten and consumed by people. Now, it's an analogy. It's not literally go have some bacon and eggs right now. Basically, the idea is that as soon as this happens, there's a knock on the door, and Peter is summoned to Caesarea, where in Caesarea, it's the center of the Roman administration. And he is told that he is supposed to be showing up in front of Cornelius, the Roman centurion, and he actually baptized the Roman centurion. Here's a group of Christians looking at this place. And he goes to Caesarea, which is about 20 miles north, and he Christians or baptizes Cornelius, the first non-Jew to be accepted into Christianity. So the analogy of the animals in the shroud was that the message of Christianity can spread around the world, not only to the Jews, but to all of the nations of the world. Another guy by the name of Paul, or Saul, that became Paul later on in the English translation, takes this dream, and it's essentially the basis of the Christian doctrine of Jesus should be exposed, or people should be exposed around the world to the idea of Jesus as the Messiah. So essentially, from JAFFA is the message or the story that all around the world, the message of Jesus as the Messiah should be spread to the world. We're continuing down towards the port of JAFFA. And again, these are all about 200 years old, these buildings. Right over here is my favorite shop. It's called Adina Plastelina. They make some really cool kind of like Themo or polymer clay that they incorporate into different jewelry, gold, silver, and it's in a ancient bathhouse. There's a secret room in there that they've excavated when they were doing some renovations and found some very interesting artifacts going all the way back to the Egyptian and the Greek and the Roman and some other time periods. And here we are finally in the port of JAFFA. And JAFFA port used to be, as I said, the main entryway to the Holy Land. But in the 1920s, when the British take over, this port is not deep enough for all of the big ships, the warships and the ships that are getting bigger and bigger. So the British abandoned JAFFA as a port, and they create a new port in the land, the port of the city of Haifa, which eventually in 1948, when the British leave, Israel, the new state of Israel, takes over Haifa very quickly, and it becomes the main port of Israel. So this is, as I said, a natural port, but even you can see that there's some kind of a breakwater that's made out of concrete, but it's on top of the reef, a natural reef, which is why going back 5,000 years, the Phoenicians were using as well. Now, here's a picture of already the early 1920s. This is a water taxi from the big ships that weren't able to go into the port, still bringing people back and forth into the port. And from here, we're going to continue along the water and get to this important site, which is the local municipality, the city hall of JAFFA, from the 1800s, the Ottoman period. And the Ottoman Sultan at the time, Ibrahim Pasha, decided that in order to show the world that his kingdom, his sultanate is up in the education and the science and all of that, he decided that in all of his cities, he's going to put a clock tower. So there are several clock towers in the state of Israel that are from that time. This is about 1850 or so. There's one in JAFFA, in Akko, in Ramle. Believe it or not, the JAFFA gate used to have a clock tower on top of it way back when. And some other cities, Tzfat has a clock tower as well. But this is the main square downtown Jaffa from the time of the Ottomans. And not far from here, there's actually a wonderful bakery called Abu Lafia, which is a great bakery. They've been there for decades and generations. And I remember when I was a teenager and came to visit in Tel Aviv, that was the only thing that was open 24/7 in Tel Aviv. If you were hungry at 2 a.m. back in those days, you'd have to come to Jaffa to get some great baked goods. And another really cool thing that they've opened up just before COVID is this new hotel that's built using some of the old buildings from the time of the Ottomans called the Satay. Anyway, we're leaving Jaffa. And how are we doing? Are there any questions in the chat? No. Okay, very good. So we're going to continue from here to Tel Aviv. And what we're going to do here is we're going to start, we left Jaffa because in 1890, about the same time that people started leaving the walls of Jerusalem, in 1890, a group of Jews decided that Jaffa is getting overcrowded. Remember, it was the Ben Gurion airport of the time. Pilgrims started coming, Russians and Germans and Italians and French, all of a sudden being able to come to the Holy Land. And the beginning of Zionism also starts somewhere in the 1880s, 1890s, and more Jewish immigrants, Zionists, are starting to come to the land. Jaffa was getting very full, so a group decided to create the first neighborhood outside of the walls of Jaffa. And this is where we are. We're going to go visit Neve Tzedek and Neve Shalom, the first neighborhood outside of the walls of Jaffa. This is a very cool area. I'm going to show you first from far away. This is one of the things that they've did there. These are not umbrellas. These are actually dancers and their skirts. This is a little closer, and it did some nice shadows on the sidewalk. Why are we seeing dancers? Because this is known as Suzan Dalal Dance Center. It's actually the center of modern dance in Israel. We're on the other side of the building that we just saw. There's a performance hall in here. And on the other side, in this building, this is actually the place where the Bat Sheva Dance Company, which is one of the most famous dance, modern dance and ballet companies in Israel. This is where they practice. This is their home base. And a lot of people come from around the world to study at Suzan Dalal. Suzan Dalal was a local resident of the neighborhood who very much enjoyed the arts and was a proponent of bringing arts to Tel Aviv a little bit later. Remember, there's no Tel Aviv yet. It's still a Jewish neighborhood of Jaffa, very courageous outside of the walls of the city. You could be attacked, you could be robbed. So what they did is they built the neighborhood as a square around. This, we're in the central square. So there were buildings and houses all around. These two major buildings, which I'll explain what they are in a moment. And in the middle was a water cistern. There were several water cisterns collecting rainwater. And what they did here was essentially started a moshava. Moshava comes from the word settling down. It's not yet a kibbutz or a moshav. It's a little bit before that, and it's essentially an agricultural town. The first ones are Rishon LeZion, Petach Tikva, Zichron Yaakov, Mazkeret Batya, and a few others. And they are mainly sponsored by a very important guy by the name of Edmund de Rothschild, the Baron, who's the Jewish philanthropist of the time, who gives money to the Zionist movement to start bringing people, Jews, to the land of Israel to eventually create a Jewish homeland for the Jews. Of course, the main character of all of this is a guy named Theodor Herzl that essentially creates the Zionist movement, the Zionist Congress in 1897. And some of the folks that come to work are white collar people that come from the first Aliyah is actually families that come mostly from Eastern Europe, and they settle in these moshavot. The next wave of immigration, the second Aliyah, are mostly youngsters like these guys, 18, 19, 20-year-old white collar families, people that were supposed to go to Yale and Brown and Stanford equivalent in their countries, and all of a sudden said, Mom, Dad, listen, I'm a Zionist. And Mom and Dad looked at them and said, okay. And no, you don't understand. The Zionist goes to Palestine to settle the land and to create a Jewish homeland. And their parents thought that they were Meshuggah completely, but eventually many of these guys came and they settled in this in the land. And you can see some of these guys, and this I think is a picture of Rishon LeZion, one of the first of these moshavot. We're going to follow a story of a man named Eliyahu. And Eliyahu is a immigrant in the second Aliyah. He actually comes in 1902 together with a woman named Golda Meirson, and together with a man named David Gruen, David Ben Gurion, and a guy named Shimon Persky, who later on becomes Shimon Peres. But all of these folks eventually come to through JAFFA. And Eliyahu wrote a letter back home to his parents saying on the first day of arriving in the land of Israel, the people that greeted him basically said to him, Eliyahu, you're crazy. What are you doing? Instead of settling down here and running out of money, take the money that you have left, go find a ship that's going back to the old country, to Odessa or to other parts of Eastern Europe. Forget it. This is crazy. There's only kadachas. I think you say that in Yiddish as well. It's only fever and malaria and no money. The Zionist idea is nice, but it's not going to happen. So Eliyahu writes back home and he says, even though this was a bit of a not so welcoming welcome to Eretz Israel, I'm going to stay. And he moves and lives in Neve Tzedek, where we are here, Neve Tzedek and Neve Shalom. And this neighborhood, as you can see, there are these trees here. These trees are citrus trees because what they were growing here, for the most part, were the famous JAFFA oranges that were taken out of JAFFA or shipped out of JAFFA to the rest of Europe. So here's a beautiful mural on the sides of this courtyard. And you can see here the JAFFA oranges. I think this picture brings it a little better. JAFFA oranges. You can see the mosque and the port of JAFFA. You can see Napoleon over here and camels bringing shipment to JAFFA, to the port. And these three gentlemen that you see, these two guys and this guy, are the founders of Neve Shalom and Neve Tzedek, the first neighborhoods outside of the walls. Now, these two guys, as you can see, they look not so European. but rather more Ottoman, because they are Jews that have stayed in the land of Israel for generations and generations. And they were the ones who gave up the land or provided the land for these neighborhoods to come up. This man is Shimon Rokach. Shimon Rokach was the leader of the community, a doctor, and eventually his son was one of the mayors of Tel Aviv later on, but this is the beginning. The second mural that you can see here is already Neve Shalom and Neve Tzedek, where we're standing. This building and the two big buildings that we turned around and saw, those are schools, boys' school and girls' school. They did send the kids to school separately, but the neighborhood is becoming modernized. There's a train that the Ottomans build between Jaffa and Jerusalem. You can see these guys over here working on the sand dunes, and they're creating a new kind of Jew, a strong, proud Jewish person who's here to settle the land, even though there's malaria, even though it's a backwater country that the Ottomans really don't pay attention to. We are going to live here and settle the land and create the base and the roots for a new Jewish country. And in the background, you can already see up at the top, some buildings, red roof buildings, the beginnings of the neighborhoods, the Jewish neighborhoods outside of Jaffa. And finally, trying to see if I can change the angle here. Finally, the third mural already, you can see a big boulevard with houses and trees on both sides. And that's already the next stage of the new city outside of Jaffa. Another group of people moves out of Jaffa and decide to create the first Hebrew city, the first Jewish city in the land of Israel, and they call it Ahuzat Bait. Ahuzat Bait, or my home estate, and more about that on our next scene, which we'll get to very soon. Karen or Jody, if there are any questions in the chat, just interrupt. But I think at this point we'll continue. Yeah.
There actually was one question about why did everybody change their names?
So there was a thing in early state of Israel that people in public figures that were in politics or big shots in the army should change their name to something Hebrew sounding. That's why Shimon Persky turned into Peres. Golda Meirson became Golda Meir. Ben Gurion actually wanted a name that would mean something very strong. So it comes from Gur Aryeh Yehuda, which is the lion cub of Judah. So Ben Gurion is really something that he specifically wanted to do, but it's still done even today. A lot of the big shots of the army and in politics change their name. I'm guilty at it too, because my last name is Dobkin. One day I approached my dad and I said, I want to change the name and make it sound more Israeli. Surprisingly, he wasn't against it. So that's how we got to Ben Dov, but it's something that's fairly common. We're in the land of the Jews. We should make our last names sound Jewish. That's really the issue here. Part of the things that were created here in Ahuzat Bait, in the first Hebrew city, was the first cinema in the land of Israel. And you can probably make out up here the name of the cinema. It was called Eden. You can actually see it in English over here too, Kolnoa Eden. And what's interesting about this is that it started in the early 20s when cinema didn't have any sound. And one of the local people that lived in Palestine at the time was a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda. Eliezer ben Yehuda, very famous. There's a Ben Yehuda street in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv. In fact, probably every city in Israel has a Ben Yehuda street. And Eliezer ben Yehuda had this crazy idea that we're living in the land of our ancestors. We should speak the language of our ancestors. And he started insisting that we speak Hebrew. Oy vey, everyone was up in arms. What do you mean speak Hebrew? It's sacrilegious. That's why we have Yiddish, so that we don't pray, we don't speak in everyday life in the language of prayer. And that's why we have Ladino in the Spanish speaking world, because we're not supposed to use Hebrew, that is the sacred language of prayer. But Ben Yehuda insisted, and eventually you understand who won this argument, because today, the state of Israel, everyone speaks Hebrew, and Hebrew is the official language. But back in the day, he was busy coming up with interesting words, because as you know, in the Bible, there was no movie theater, and there was no cars, and there was no telephone, and there was no TV and all of that stuff. And all of these things have words in Hebrew that are invented. And in fact, he invented a name for the movie cinema, and it's called Ri'a Noah. Noah means movement, Re'i, mirror or view. So this is movement and some kind of view. Now, of course, in 1930 something, when the first sound movie came out, they had to change the name. So Re'i Noah didn't work anymore. So they changed it to Kol Noah, which is the word we actually use today in modern Hebrew. Kol, voice, Noah, movement. So some of the words that he actually changed caught on, and they're being used even today. So what this is one of my favorite buildings, by the way. It's dilapidated and bad shape. I hope the municipality will do something about it. And here on the on this door is my favorite graffiti in all of Tel Aviv, because this is the ticket booths. You see these two stands over here. This is where you would buy a ticket. So imagine Israelis standing in line, which is an oxymoron in and of itself. And on the door there, it says, Slicha, ani rak she'ela, which is a beautiful Israelism, when Israelis are standing in line and then someone comes from the side and says, I just have a quick question. I just want to figure out something before I have to stand in line. And next thing you know, they're there getting a ticket in front of you and they cut the line. So I don't know who wrote this here, but this is a classic right by the movie theater ticket booth to have that kind of statement. Anyway, you had to be there. Moving forward to the first boulevard that was created in Achuzat Bait, and we're talking 1909, the beginning of this Achuzat Bait, or this town. 65 families get together from those families that wanted to create the first Hebrew city. Eliyahu, our friend, was one of those families. After he was living in Neve Shalom as a youngster, he met his wife and they get married. They're very much close to the big shots of the Jewish agency. He's good friends with Ben Gurion. And Eliyahu is one of these 65 families that, I think this is the picture of it. No, here we go. 65 families standing on the sand dunes. This is where we are in Rothschild Boulevard. Look at all the sand dunes around. And they're drawing a lottery. Who's going to get which piece of land on this special boulevard in the city of Achuzat Bait? They also decide to change the name of the city. And here's the boulevard several years later, with the trees and the houses on each side. They name it Rothschild Boulevard after the Baron Edmund de Rothschild, who was the sponsor, the philanthropist that gave the money for the beginning of the Zionist movement. And they decide to change the name of the city to Tel Aviv. Why Tel Aviv? It's a tribute to Theodor Herzl, who wrote a book, the leader of the Zionist movement, wrote a book called Alt Neuland, the Old New Country. And oddly enough, my daughter in 7th grade was just reading the book. She was amazed to hear that I actually heard about it and that I know some of the story. But it was interesting because here in Israel in 7th grade in 2021, we're still reading that book that Herzl wrote. And Alt Neuland means old new country. So as a tribute to Herzl, what they did here is they took the word TEL, which we've learned earlier is an artificial hill with all of the layers of history representing the old, and the word AVIV, which means spring, rejuvenation, renewal. And they put those two together. So Tel Aviv literally means old and new together. And that was the new name of the city of Tel Aviv. And we're standing at the fountain and the memorial that was built in the 50-year anniversary of the city of Tel Aviv, 1959. And on it is a mural. You can see at the bottom, people working hard, sand dunes, a new city coming up. The second layer is already houses and a main building that unfortunately today does not exist anymore, called the Gymnasia Herzliya, or the high school named after Herzl. And the amazing thing about this high school that was in Tel Aviv, the first Hebrew city, was that the language of teaching in that high school, the first in the land, was Hebrew. Of course, the first Hebrew speaking high school in the land, Gymnasia Herzliya. And finally, the top layer, late 1950s, Habima and some other cultural icons of the city of Tel Aviv. In the 1930s and 40s and 50s, Tel Aviv grows from 65 families to close to 50,000 residents. And all along this time, Eliyahu, our friend, is living on one of these places along Rothschild Boulevard. And of course, the first mayor of Tel Aviv is this man, Mayor Dizengoff. Mayor was actually his first name. Mayor means light or will light. And he was the mayor, so he was Mayor Dizengoff. And he used to ride around town on his female horse, which you can see here in the statue. So a female horse is a mare. So in fact, his name is Mayor Dizengoff. And here he is, a statue of him on Rothschild Boulevard, right in front of where he used to live. This is his house. I know it doesn't look much like a house that you live in, because unfortunately, Mayor Dizengoff dies 1935, I think, mid-30s. The city's already 35,000 people. He leaves his house. His wife, unfortunately, dies a little bit before that. And he leaves his house to his second love, as he calls it, the city of Tel Aviv. And his house becomes the Museum of Tel Aviv, an art museum, which is why it's been changed, the very few windows. And after a few years, when it becomes the museum, the Second World War breaks out. And after it's over, 1948, the 14th of May, what happens in this house is the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. So this is essentially Independence Hall of the State of Israel. You can see David Ben-Gurion here on the banners. Fortunately or unfortunately, today it's going through some serious renovations. You used to be able to go in and visit. Hopefully in about a year it should be done. But you can see on the day that this was going on, it was supposed to be a secret. And you know that between Jews, we can't really keep a secret. So why did they wanted to keep a secret? Because the War of Independence broke out already 6 months before. And what's going on here is that the big shots of the newly established state of Israel didn't want to be subject to attacks by the Egyptian Air Force that were worried about being bombed. So it was supposed to be a secret, but on Friday afternoon, the 14th of May, 1948, 300 people assemble, the big shots of the Jewish agency, the big shots of the Jewish community in the land, assembled together with hundreds of people waiting outside. And let's go inside and see what happened. Look at this space. You can see some of the artwork. This is the official place where the Declaration of Independence took place. Imagine 320 people crammed into this space. And up above was actually a balcony that was opened. And on that balcony was a tizmoret. Wow, there was a band, maybe not a band, an orchestra. And the orchestra was there because they decided the night before that the official song that will become the national anthem of the state of Israel is Hatikva, the song that we all know today as the official anthem. And what we have here, you can see Herzl, who dies decades before, but still there as part of the vision, the official Declaration of Independence. And this is actually a reenactment that happened a few years later, but this is what it looked like. David Ben-Gurion reading from the Declaration of Independence, all of the big shots, 36 provisional government members sitting here. These are the folks that signed the Declaration of Independence. By the way, 2 women, one of them, you definitely know who she is. Her name is Golda Meir. She was part of the provisional government, of course, later on prime minister. And the Declaration of Independence itself, by the way, not written on parchment like we think, but rather on pieces of paper, because there were lots of arguments about what it should say there. And our friend Eliyahu, who happens to be my great uncle, is one of the 36 signatures over here. And I have a picture of him. This is him, Eliyahu Dobkin, who's my great uncle. He's the brother of my great grandfather. My great grandfather moved to the United States in 1903. My grandfather was actually born in the US already. And his older brother moved to Palestine, and his name is Eliyahu Dobkin. And a lot of, when people ask me an interesting fact about me, I say, one of my ancestors signed the Declaration of Independence. And it takes a while till they realize I'm not talking about the American Declaration of Independence. But Eliyahu Dobkin is one of the people who signs the signatures down here, one of these 36 people sitting up here in this counter. As soon as the declaration is read and David Ben-Gurion says in his funny voice, "This meeting is adjourned. The state of Israel has been formed. Thank you very much. Shabbat Shalom." It was a Friday afternoon. It took 32 minutes, that's it, for this whole event to take place. And as soon as it was over, from the balcony up here, all of a sudden, no one knew that the orchestra is up there. All of a sudden, the music of Hatikva starts flowing down around the people. People were in tears as it is. It was a very emotional event. And they started singing Hatikva, saying Shechianu, and from here, the state of Israel is established. So Baruch Hashem, the state of Israel is established. Thank you for joining me. I think I went a little bit over time. No, we're okay. Very good. One of the other stories that I can tell you is that my brother divorced and remarried, and his new wife, this is already 10 years ago, used to say to me, you know, you have to talk to my dad. She knew I was a tour guide. And turns out that her dad was in the Palmach, the Israeli, pre-Israeli army before the Declaration of Independence. And when he was a teenager, he lived in Tel Aviv, and he used to work in an audio-visual store, the only one in Tel Aviv. And he was in the Palmach, and one morning, it was the 13th of May, his commander says to him, listen, Moishik, you got to go back home. And he's like, why? I'm here in the front line. What do you mean you got to go home? I got a message from Yankale, who knows your dad, who knows your this. You got to go home. So he goes back home. And when he comes home on his way back to his house, he walks by his old place of work, the store. And the owner of the store says to him, hey, Chaim, I'm glad to see you. Come in here. Listen, I have a secret to tell you. You have to swear that you don't tell anybody. This was Thursday afternoon. I need you to come tomorrow to the Dizengoff house at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I need you to help me set up the audio visual or the mics for this event. And he's at, what event? What are you talking about? I got to do laundry at home. My comrades are waiting for me by Jerusalem. Anyway, his previous employer says, listen, it's all the way down from whoever, you got to stay. He stays. Turns out that my sister-in-law's dad was the guy who was pressing the buttons to make these microphones work. He was sitting up on the balcony, a front row seat for this major event in the story of our people. And he told me a funny story. He said, you know, all of this stuff was donated. The chairs, the table, the flags, the picture of Herzl, and of course, the microphones. No one thought that we would want to keep it as a museum later on in the life of the state of Israel. And once it was over, it was all given back to who it was owned. And that's it. They had to, sometime in the 90s, when they realized that this is something important, they had to somehow find all of these items. But he said the owner of my shop that I worked for didn't want any money. They were trying to give him money for the rental. And he said, I don't want any money. The only thing I want is to have the name of my store placed front and center on this microphone. And the name of the store was Tzlil, which means sound. And it's essentially the first advertisement in the state of Israel, the name of the store that was placed here on the microphones, that of course is seen all around the world today as the Declaration of Independence. So just a fascinating story, and you never know who you're going to run into when you tell these stories. Okay, questions, aha moments. Why did so many decide to change their names? Okay, very good.
So if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can type it in the chat.
You
By
would
the
like
way,
to tell us, oh,
yes,
I have a
Susie.
question. You were
Sure.
going to explain the significance of the Jonah and the big fish for 3 days.
That's right. That's right. Thank you. So Peter, originally in the story in the Christian Bible, he doesn't start out as Peter. That's a very European name. His name is actually Simon, son of Jonah, Shimon bar Yonah. And it's an interesting question. Why Jonah? Why was he son of Jonah? So some of the speculations is that when Jesus says to him, you are the rock on top of which I will build my church. The New Testament, the Christian Bible, is written in Greek, and the word Petros means rock. So when he says, you are the rock on top of which I will build my church, he says, you are Petros. So from that point on, he's referred to as Simon Peter. Okay, so he's Simon Peter from that point on. notice that Jonah was 3 days in the whale and then resurrected. Same thing, Jesus was in the tomb from Friday until Sunday, 3 days, and then resurrected and went out and started a new assignment or a new version. The story of Jonah in many ways has a lot of parallels to the story of Jesus and the way he was reborn, so to speak, out of the tomb, and then went on his way to continue his true assignment that was given to him by God. So there's a lot of parallels there. And it's interesting because a lot of times when I work with Christian groups, many of them don't know enough or don't know the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Jesus was a Jew who knew his Old Testament very, very well. And a lot of the references, a lot of the analogies that he makes are making connections to stories from the Old Testament. And for example, Jonah and the reference to the three, Daniel in the lion's den, there's all kinds of references that are connected to the Old Testament and the Jewish Bible. Thank you for reminding me, Susie. I forgot about that.
Okay, before I ask the next question, since it's a political question, everybody feel free to stay on as long as you'd like, but I do want to thank Gadi and I want to thank all of you for joining us, and I hope that you all learned something new and saw some new sites, both ancient and modern. Okay, so I will continue. Put on your magic ball and tell us who's going to win the election.
Oh, okay, I just saw that. First of all, about the Palmach Museum. Yes, we do go to the Palmach Museum sometimes, depending on the tour. But that is the Palmach is the Jewish militia before the organization of the IDF. Very interesting museum. It's you're actually following through recruitment and becoming part of the Palmach before the establishment of the state of Israel. Who's going to win the election? So the winning the election and becoming prime minister are two different things. So who's going to win the election? Probably Netanyahu and the Likud. They will have the largest number of seats. However, they don't have enough seats to form a government, which means that they need to make agreements with smaller parties to be able to form a coalition, which needs to get to 61 seats at least. There are 120 seats. In order to pass a bill, you need at least 61. Netanyahu is predicted to get about 28 to 29 seats. That is a long way until you get to 61. So he's going to need to make a lot of agreements with different parties in order to get to that coveted 61. Whether or not he'll succeed is an interesting question. Right now, a lot of the predictions are that neither the left nor the right have the ability to form a coalition that will get them to more than 61. So it basically means that we are probably looking at yet another election round in a few months. And many of us are saying we got to change the system because clearly this is not really working. So I suspect that at some point that's going to happen. The president is not really a political person. He's more like the Queen of England. So it's really a multi-party system that is supposed to be working like the European systems, but the European systems are in trouble as well. Look at Italy, look at Greece. It's a very similar political system. So I'm pretty sure Netanyahu will get the most seats. I suspect that the coalition of against Netanyahu will probably succeed better than him putting together a coalition. But that's just me. I'm really not a political analyst, and I have no idea. In protest interpretation. In Protestant, yeah. Yes, so absolutely. Thank you, Jane. In the Protestant, the idea of the rock on top of which I will build my church, it's more of a general concept or an affirmation, absolutely, of the idea of the continuation or the followers of Christ or the believers. Absolutely, it's not a physical. Protestant world does not see the idea of a pope as feasible. The Pope in the Catholic world is a representative of God on earth, and that doesn't sit well with some of the streams of Christianity. So that's definitely interpreted in a different way. Yofi,
All right.
thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you again. We hope to be offering some more tours later this spring or early summer. And if anybody, when the airways open up, if you want to go to Israel and you need a guide, Gadi is there for you. We've used him multiple times and love having him travel to Israel with us, around Israel. So again, thank you on behalf of the Federation, and everybody have a wonderful Pi Day today. It's 3/14.
All right, that's right. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Karen and Jody, for inviting me to this series. It was great, and hopefully we'll do this again. Toda rabah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.